Shalom everybody, I'm David Dubow, and I'd like to share a learning with you from Parshat Yitro, chapter 18 in the book of Exodus. We're going to do it a little bit differently today. I'd like to first take note of something that Dr. Jordan Peterson has to say about the Parsha. We'll let him speak in his own words, and then we're going to analyze it, and hopefully it's going to take us to a better understanding of what this Parsha is all about. I'm going to critique Peterson's reading, and hopefully share with something that's even better.
Everything in its proper place, right? That's the principle of subsidiarity. That's the principle of the alternative to tyranny that's developed in the story of Jethro and Moses in Exodus. So what happens in Exodus is that Moses is set up or sets himself up as the ultimate judge over the Israelites, right? They're in the desert. They've escaped from tyranny. They have a slave mentality. They're all fractious. They're squabbling amongst themselves because there's no hierarchy of authority. So Moses sets himself up as judge, and he's judging them from early in the morning till late at night. And his father-in-law, who's a Midianite priest, an archetype of the beneficial foreigner in some sense, was a very common theme in the Old Testament, tells Moses he has to stop doing that because he can't handle it first. It's going to wear him to a frazzle because no one can do that, to be judge of everything, and no one but God, let's say. But it's also really bad for the Israelites, and the reason for that is if Moses makes all the decisions, then what are they? Just infants? Are they just children? Do they have no responsibility of their own? Real responsibility, right? Not artificial responsibility doled out from on high, but real responsibilities. Jethro tells Moses to divide the Israelites up into a hierarchy. Every 10 nominates a leader, let's say a representative, and then the representatives unite and do the same thing all the way up to units of 10,000, and then Moses only does the uppermost judging, and that's the proper alternative to tyrannical structure.
Now there are two main points here that I'd like to take issue with. The first is that Moshe is a potential tyrant. That's the story. That were it not for the fact that Jethro shows up and introduces this plan, Moshe would have taken over the nation and ruled them as a tyrant rules his people. The second issue is that the suggestion that Jethro brings, this hierarchy of setting up the judges as captains of the thousands and then the hundreds and the fifties and the tens, this distribution of responsibility, what Peterson calls subsidiarity, is in fact a better solution. Now, this is an excellent example of what I'm seeking to do because Peterson's made this suggestion, and that forced me to go back and read the text again and ask the question, what was Moshe thinking? What was the plan when Moshe set out Lamocharat the next day and sat there judging the nation with everybody gathered around and he sitting there unmediated direct contact to the entire nation? Is that a better or a worse plan? Now, lest you think that I am making a large issue of a comment that Peterson made at this Jerusalem gathering, which I, in fact, attended, the answer is no. In his book, We Who Wrestle with God, this is a central chapter and a big part of Peterson's thinking. Let me read you one passage from We Who Wrestle with God in order to show you just how central this idea is to Peterson. The invitation to become a judge of the Israelites therefore poses the risk of a dangerous inflation of ego or narrow self to Moses, the threat to the integrity of his soul attendant on his taking to himself as his own accomplishment or talent the authority that has been delegated to him as a prophet of God. This is the terrible path of the religious hypocrites, those who use God's name in vain and who pray in public. And there he's quoting Matthew from the Beatitudes, talking about Jews who gather on the corners, on the streets, in order to pray in public and to be seen for doing so. This is the mode of being of the Pharisees, who much later conspire in such a deadly fashion against Christ himself. What Peterson is saying is that Moses could have been the archetypical Pharisee, and that it took Jethro, the idea of the outsider, the foreigner, to save him from this tendency. That's a large accusation, and I think it's false in the main, and I'd like to break it down for you and dismiss it. In order to really properly understand what's going on here, we have to return to the original Koine Greek in which the New Testament was written and understand the meaning of the word hypocrite. It breaks down in Greek to hypokrati, beneath the mask, and it refers to an actor, an actor in the Greek theater because they wore masks in Greek theater. Understand that the New Testament is being written 500-600 years after Athenian theater saw the likes of Sophocles, and the play Oedipus was staged to great acclaim. So this is a concept that is out there in the world. Greeks, being actors, are hypocrites. It's about playing it out in real world in order to be seen doing so. Now, Jesus contrasts this in the Beatitudes and says, I recommend that you go into a room, you shut the door, and you pray that way, for no one needs to see you but your Father in heaven. Jews, of course, are known for gathering 10 at a time to make a quorum on the street corners, on the airplanes, at the bus stops, and making their minyanim and praying together, because we are halachically oriented. We are oriented to work in this world to fulfill law and embody it in action. It's important that we do what we're told, not just think it or feel it inside our hearts. The idea of acting out the Word of God, you would think, is something that Dr Peterson would appreciate.
So people often ask me, do you believe in God? Which I don't like that question. It's a question that doesn't work for me on multiple levels of analysis. But strangely enough, just as we were talking, the answer to that question popped into my head. I act as if God exists. Now, you can decide for yourself whether that means that I believe in him, so to speak. But I act as if he exists. That's a good enough answer for that.
I act as if God exists. That's not an answer that was offhand, but it was an oft-repeating theme that Peterson says in many different contexts. It's a very Jewish answer. It's about placing my actions, the way I manifest in this world, the decisions that I make, what I do as a reflection of what I believe, more important than the feelings or the catechisms that I recite inside my own mind. Hypocrisy, then, is not about duplicity, about believing one thing inside and doing something else on the outside. That's a modern trope that has been added to hypocrisy. Its original meaning is to be an actor. It's about the concern about doing things outwardly. It's about abiding by the law, the script of life, and acting it out in reality. And when the Jews gathered that day to listen to Moshe teach them about the law, they were concerned about doing the right thing in the world. And you can't do that unless you have been taught and educated what the law is. In Peterson's reading, the Jewish people were this immature mob, a rabble he calls them, that were interested in foisting responsibility upon Moshe. We don't want to decide what to do. We don't want to take responsibility for our own lives. Moshe, you tell us how to live. But that's not what a law-based society is about. In a law-based society, you need to know what the law states. For Peterson's idea, as long as you're upwardly aiming, as long as you have a conscience, you'll figure out the right thing to do. Now, that may be true in the main, and I believe it is, but when you have a law-based society, two people, meaning with the best intentions but still having a conflict of interest, can come to the conclusion that that cow was your responsibility. No, that cow is your responsibility. I adequately watched the cow. No, you did not adequately watch the cow. You're guilty of negligence. No, I'm not guilty of negligence. These are questions which even high-minded, conscientious people will come into conflict about. And the law is there to adjudicate. The law is there to figure out how competing priorities, well-minded people who define things differently, can come to some sort of agreement about how we should act in a given situation. Peterson has this passage about referees aren't needed when everyone in the game is concerned about abiding by the law. The point is, judges sit and do nothing when everybody is good. Think about a baseball game. Even when everybody's abiding by the rules, you still need an umpire to judge if a runner is out. Did the ball reach the catcher's hand first, or did the runner reach the plate first? You need adjudication, even when everybody is upwardly aiming. Again, a law-based society is about definitions, fine line of deciding where the limits of free speech end and the dictates of safety to the public begin. it needs to be judged. Even people who are conscientious won't be able to figure this out. What they will do is they will all agree to submit to a third authority who is empowered to make those judgments. It's not that if everybody was conscientious, we would not need judges. Law requires adjudication, and that's why the Jewish people had gathered after the Torah had been given to learn about the law. Let's return to the question of Moses as the potential tyrant. Now, Peterson makes a good point, which is a tyrant requires a slavish people. People perhaps start by wishing to offload their responsibility in life and beget themselves a tyrant who will answer all the questions that they don't want to have to answer for themselves. So we first addressed that question and answered that the Jewish people who have brought their conflicts to Moshe for adjudication are anything but irresponsible. That is the responsible thing to do, to want to know what the law is and want to know what to do in situations of conflict. We've dismissed the Jewish people as a Slavish nation, at least here. Now, it's true they were begging for man and complaining in the desert and the water that wasn't there. They had lots of growth to do. That's true. But the point is to see that as everyone. Everybody is overcoming a kind of temptation to hedonism. That's certainly true. But it is not fair to judge people that want to have Moshe decide for them what to do, what the law is, and describe that people as being slavish in doing so. And I don't think Moshe was being tyrannical in setting himself up as the judge. He was the person lidrosh et Elohim, to inquire after God. He was the prophet who understood the law better than anyone else. Who else but him to teach the people what to do in the given situations? Who else but him had the best, clearest, most explicit understanding of the law and its finer points? And he is the best teacher for the moment. This larger point of Moshe as seeking to exert power is something that Peterson develops, and he points to several instances of Moshe killing the Egyptian who was beating up the Hebrew, Moshe executing judgment and executing Jews in the aftermath of the golden calf, and of course Moshe hitting the rock as opposed to speaking to the rock. First of all, it's a terrible mischaracterization of Moses. Moses, who when he was appointed by God at the burning bush, took 3-4 times rounds of argumentation where God said, okay, I'll set up Aaron together with you. And Moshe still says, no, please send somebody else. Moshe, who argued with God, initiates the power transfer over to Joshua. Moshe, who when he discovers that two people were prophesying in the camp, Eldad and Medad, says, over the objection of Joshua, who says, incarcerate them, Moshe says, I wish everybody was a prophet like me. This is the power-mad Moses that you're talking about, who's seeking to assert himself at the top of this hierarchy? That's not true. What is true is that Moshe had a propensity to violence. Moshe was incensed when he saw the Egyptian killing or abusing that Jew, and he took action into his own hands at his own expense. Remember, the day later, two Jews are fighting, and Moses says, why are you guys fighting? And they say, oh, are you going to do to us what you did to that Egyptian? And Moses says, oh my goodness, the thing is known, and runs away. When you put yourself outside the law for the sake of justice to save somebody, you make yourself vulnerable. You are not accruing power to yourself. Those Jews found themselves to be empowered to exploit this weakness in Moses. Moses could have publicly, strongly strode up into that place and struck that man down, the Egyptian man down, and had been an intimidating force to reckon with. But Moses instead tried to do it in private. He tried to have nobody else know about it so that power or intimidation would not accrue to him as a result. Moses made himself go into exile because he stepped up to do what no man in that action was ready to do, and execute summary justice against that abusing taskmaster. But there's something else going on here, which I find also troubling. There's an assumption when Peterson says that Moses was being too violent or too power hungry in showing this violence, was that somebody else could have done it better. Somebody else could have talked that taskmaster into being a better person. Somebody else wouldn't have to punish the Jewish people in the aftermath of the golden calf. Maybe he could have reformed them. Maybe he could have persuaded them into never doing it again. There's an assumption when justice is meted out that that is a failing, in that better people would have solved the problem without punishing people. And that is a terrible thing to say about Moses. In fact, we're in a war right now. And Hamas cannot be reasoned with. Just like that taskmaster or a Nazi guard cannot be reasoned with. There are people for whom the only solution is violence. And that to make the assumption that better people could have done that job better without resorting to violence is a difficult, bad, mean-spirited accusation, which I reject on behalf of Moses. Let's address this remaining question about Moshe hitting the rock when he should have spoken to it. Indeed, at Masa Umeriva, this is cited as one of the reasons why Moshe cannot enter into the promised land. And it seems that speaking is certainly better than hitting the rock. But you have to remember that sometimes hitting the rock is what God desires. Moshe just previously at Horeb was instructed to strike the rock and bring forth water. Sometimes that is the proper response. So Moshe is guilty of not discerning, not listening to the moment properly, defaulting to the earlier suggestion, which is the time is to hit the rock, and not being attendant to the new instruction, which is speak to the rock. Yes, speaking is better, but sometimes hitting is necessary. That's the lesson, and not a power-hungry Moshe. We turn now to our final question. What was Moshe thinking when he sat there in solitary judgment of the entire nation? And what did Jethro propose to improve upon what Moshe was doing? We've already negated the supposition of Dr Peterson that Moshe was filling a power vacuum, that the Jewish people had there slavishly abdicated responsibility, and Moses was on the slippery road to tyranny as he sat there as a solitary judge, accruing power to himself, arrogating the position of judge of the entire people, and he was on his way to become a tyrant. So if that's not the case, what was it? So we have to take a look at the exchange between Moses and Jethro. Moses explains what he was doing after Jethro says, this isn't good. Moses says like this, Ki yavo elai ha'am lidrosh Elohim, when the people approach me in order to inquire after God. Ki yelehem davar, ba'elai, when they have something, meaning this is not all the time. This is not for their entire lives. When they have something which requires judgment, they come to me. V'shafateti ben ish ubein re'ehu. I don't tell people individually what they need to do. I'm not giving them their goals and their life aspirations. I am judging between people who are in conflict. And in so doing, v'hodati et chukei ha'elohim ve'et torotav. I make known, I teach the laws of God and his Torot, his rules. Jethro counters. He says, you're going to wear yourself thin. This isn't going to work. Instead, Jethro says, do this. V'hisharta ethem. You should warn them. You should exhort them. You should preach to them. Et chukim ve'et Torot. The laws and the statutes. V'hodata lehem, it's the same verb now, make known to them, teach them something. But what is Jethro proposing to teach? Et derech yelchu ba, the way in which they should go. Ve'et ma'aseh asher ya'asun, and the things they should be doing. Meaning, teach them general principles. Teach them to be good people. Teach them how to walk the straight and narrow. Moralize them. abstract the principles to 12 rules of life, and that should be enough. They don't have to know the details of the law. They just have to know 12 basic habits of good living, and that should be enough. Of course, there needs to be people who know the rules, but that is 1 in 10. 1 in 10 needs to know the rules. The 9 out of 10 can be illiterate, just have to be good people. And this is not what Moshe was proposing. This is not the Jewish way. The Jewish way is everybody is a potential judge. Everybody studies the law. Everybody is literate and imbibes the law, knows it inside themselves, acts accordingly, does the rules because they understand it, and they could at any time reverse position and stand in judgment against their fellow. And that is in fact how the Jewish system of law works. There is no appointed caste. There is no self-appointed elite for whom this is the job to know the rules. It is the purview and the responsibility of every single Jew to know the law. And therefore, not 1 in 10 are experts, but 10 out of 10 are the experts. And this is what Moses wanted. Anyway, what's the difference if you have 1 out of 10 or 10 out of 10? There is already a huge amount of education that has to happen. Jethro was proposing, as Peterson properly points out, a subsidiarity system, that people had expertise, people would specialize. And Moses was saying, there are no specialists. Ideally, everybody is educated in order to know, to do, enact, and even judge if called upon. We have ad hoc tribunals in Torah. Jethro's system was not what came to be Jewish law. We don't have any higher courts, middle courts, lower courts. We do have local courts. We have a Sanhedrin, which was supposed to be appointed in each and every city. They're locally distributed, but they're not hierarchical. And there is, of course, one national assembly. But none of this intervening bureaucracy, 10, 50, 100, 1,000, which sets people up in particular strata of society, and they are privileged in that way. The expectation was the nation would gather and watch Moses adjudicate case after case. They would learn. They'd figure out the precedences. They won't be taught jurisprudence as an abstract level of principles, but they would watch case by case what is done here, what is done there, what is done in each individual situation. And they would learn. And eventually, over time, they would say, oh, we remember when that happened, or remember what Moshe ruled over there. And Moses, as the expert who had just been filled with the divine law, was the person to teach people what to do as you go down into the details and you figure out which principle is more important in various situations that arise in life. It's an organic legal system. Only retrospectively do you abstract the principles of jurisprudence. You look at the cases, you see what people organically decided in the moment, and then you build the jurisprudence principles based upon that. But it starts with real cases, real people with real problems. It was a large aspiration, Moshe's plan, to homeschool an entire nation, to have them taught directly from the expert, case by case, and take time, patiently, training them to listen to the precedences so that they could eventually do it themselves in the ideal fashion. This was difficult. Jethro says, this will wear yourself out. We don't have time. We don't have time to wait for this process to take root, to make everybody literate long enough and thoroughly enough so that they can take responsibility. We need a solution now. Let's create a hierarchy. Let's create a professional class of judges, of bureaucrats, of people in mid-level government whose job it is to learn and decide the immediate thing that they're trained for and specialized in front of them. What Jethro proposed was that the small things would be left to those small-scale judges, and the large things would filter the way up to Moshe. Moshe realized that this was definitely going to fail, because when the small people receive in front of them a large case, a precedent-changing, a Supreme Court case, not realizing that this is a deep conflict that we have to readjust the rules of free speech versus public safety, they, being low-level judges, they won't realize that this is something that they are not equipped to see the depth and pass it up the line. They will think they know, and that is the problem with a hierarchy. It is a concession. It's something that you do when you don't have time, when you have to be efficient, but it's not the best way. When Peterson describes this idea of subsidiarity, he describes its derivation, or the way it evolved, and eventually became to be adopted by the Catholic Church. Pope Leo XIII, in an encyclical of 1891, wrote this: "Just as it is gravely wrong to take from individuals what they can accomplish by their own initiative and industry and give it to the community, so also it is an injustice and at the same time a grave evil and disturbance of right order to assign to a greater and higher association what lesser and subordinate organizations can do." This idea, this principle, Dr. Peterson holds up as an example of an ideal. I read it and I say this is an example of a concession to reality. This is what priests always do. Midianite priests, Catholic priests, and Egyptian priests. Remember, Egypt was a highly specialized hierarchical society. They built their society through pyramids, and the priestly class were the people who knew how to read and write and engrave tombstones and write all the incantations that ushered somebody into the next world. They were the specialists. They were the holders of knowledge, and they held on to it tight. The approach of the Torah is that there is no specialized knowledge that is the purview of only the priestly caste. It needs to be taught to everyone. Like Moshe, who wasn't a priest, he was just a Levite, was meant to embody, to demonstrate, to model. You see, when there is a specialization which is instantiated, which is fixed, this hierarchy of people filtering up and filtering down, the 10s who turn into the people of 100. Dr. Peterson proposed that the way it would happen was those judges of 10 would get together and vote on the 100, and the 100 would vote on the 1,000, when in point of fact it would happen the other way around. It would start at the top. Moses would appoint the highest level of judges, and they would appoint the lower ones and the lower ones, and what would happen was judges would always invite the people that looked like them. Power would become entrenched. It's really a problem that we're seeing today, both in the American situation and in the Israeli situation, where a certain class of society which believes certain principles hold on to the judiciary and just replicate their same ideas, holding on to it and impose it upon everybody. And it's very hard to change when you have a specialized class that votes themselves in and replicates this entrenched ideas of the judiciary. This is what Moses was fighting against, and it's what this principle of subsidiarity tries to entrench. Priests are always saying that we have a job that is so important, we need to be left alone from the menial, mundane matters so we can sit and think those big thoughts. It's a grave evil and a disturbance of right order to make us this greater and higher association to do what lesser people can do. In other words, there's a class of people who are above and beyond the menial thing of raising a family. They don't have to teach children or change diapers or take out the garbage. They should be left alone in a place by themselves so that they can attend to the highest order of things. That is, again, not the Jewish way. Priests who attended to the temple did so in 2-week shifts, and then they went back to their villages, and they taught, but they were also parents, and they also took out the garbage, and they were only in this protected environment 2 weeks out of the year. In fact, the highest avoda, the highest duty to do inside of the temple was to take out the garbage. We called it Trumat Hadeshen. It's the cleaning out the ashes at the beginning of the day. And that was considered not menial, but a tremendous privilege to attend to something which anybody could do. But you were doing it in service of the temple. What we really want is not specialization, but a integrated, unified idea of knowledge, of jobs, of how everything integrates. The ideal is a parent who knows a little bit about everything. They know how to train their kid to tie their shoelace and throw a baseball and cook and to clean and to make their bed. And they know how to make a living, and they know how to read the newspaper, and they know how to vote. And they train their child in all of those things. There's nothing higher or lower about it. That's the ideal. Integrated personalities who can do the small things, the big things, the difficult things. When Moshe rephrases Jethro's proposal, he doesn't talk about big things and small things. He talks about difficult things and small things. The difficult things will be passed up the line, not because they are beneath anybody, but because they're hard and can't be figured out. That's perhaps where you need expertise. But expertise is really a possibility in everybody. There's a popular wisdom that anybody can do. This is really a critique of bureaucracy, of professionalizing knowledge, of making school teachers the experts who go out there and teach our children. Yes, we do it. Moses took Jethro's advice. It's a concession. You need to do that to save time and to spare resources. It is sometimes more efficient, but it is not the ideal. Now, the best example of the Jethro approach gone too far, of this idea of subsidiarity being taken to the extreme, is the profession of psychology. Now, I can say that. I can level a critique. I'm not calling you out, Dr. Peterson, because my own wife is a psychologist, and so this critique hits close to home. But ideally, somebody who's struggling with an emotional problem, someone who's having difficulty managing life or relationships, should go to a grandmother, to a good friend, to a teacher, to the pastor. There shouldn't be a privileged body of knowledge of how to live life that is the purview of specialized people. The idea that particular people are empowered to teach people to do something as basic as having sex is ridiculous. These are knowledges that is the stuff of life, and it belongs to everybody. It's not something that you need to learn specifically years and years at school. It's something that you learn by living life. And that's how we regard Torah. Torah is something that belongs to everybody. It's not something that belongs to any sort of specialized caste, any sort of bureaucratic experts. Torah is how you live life. It's for everyone. Now, it's true, even in Jewish society, that people do specialize. And we do have experts in this area and that area. But the goal is to understand that's not the ideal, that's a concession. And we strive to be those integrated people that have the basic understandings of all those knowledges inside of us. Please God, we'll learn from Jethro of what to do to be more efficient. But we'll learn more from Moses about what it means to embody and live Torah in a Torah society. Shabbat Shalom.